She found the advertisement on a Tuesday, folded inside a newspaper someone had left on the kitchen table. The kind of accident that looks like nothing until it becomes everything. Elena Whitmore read it twice, then a third time, her hands going still over the dirty dishes her aunt had ordered her to wash before sunrise. Rancher seeks honest woman. Not wealth, not beauty. Courage and a willing heart. 3 sentences that shouldn't have meant a thing to a girl with no money, no family, and no map to anywhere better than here. But her aunt's voice was already rising from the back room. "Elena, those floors better be spotless by the time I come out there." And Elena looked at the advertisement one more time, and something in her chest that had been quiet for a very long time woke up and said, "Go." If you've ever stood at the edge of a choice that could ruin you or save you, and you couldn't tell which was which, then you already know how this story begins. Stay with us through every part of Elena's journey. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next, and hit that like button so we know you're here. Drop your city and country in the comments below. We want to see just how far this story travels. The morning Elena Whitmore turned 18, her Aunt Margaret gave her a list. It was written on the back of an old receipt in Margaret's cramped, pressured handwriting. 12 items that needed doing before the household went to bed that night. The windows in the front parlor needed washing inside and out. The rugs needed beating. The winter preserves needed inventorying and restacking in the cellar. And if even one jar was out of order, Margaret would know, because Margaret always knew. At the bottom of the list, underlined twice, "Do not expect anything for your birthday. Gratitude is not given to girls who contribute so little." Elena folded the list and put it in her apron pocket without saying a word. She had learned a long time ago that saying words to Aunt Margaret was like pouring water into sand. It disappeared without a trace, and the ground stayed just as dry and hard as it had been before. She was not Margaret's daughter. She had never pretended to be. Her mother, Margaret's younger sister, had died when Elena was 4 years old, and her father had followed 2 years after that. And Margaret had taken her in with the quiet, settled fury of a woman who had accepted an obligation she never wanted and had decided that the least Elena could do was make herself useful in return. Useful was the word Margaret used. You need to make yourself useful, Elena. Nobody keeps useless things around. Elena had made herself useful every day for 12 years. She woke before Margaret. She lit the stove. She cooked the breakfast and washed the dishes and swept the floors and scrubbed the front steps and ironed the clothes and minded the garden and hauled the firewood and repaired what needed repairing with the meager tools available to her, because Margaret did not believe in wasting money on repairmen when there was a girl in the house perfectly capable of doing it herself. Elena had learned to sew, to mend, to butcher a chicken, to pickle vegetables, to quiet a screaming pipe with a rag and a prayer. She had learned these things not because anyone taught her gently, but because failing to learn them meant Margaret's voice raised to a register that made the kitchen windows vibrate. What she had not learned was how to want things for herself without immediately killing the want before it could take root. That came from years of practice, too. The newspaper had been left by Mr. Alcott, a traveling textile salesman who rented Margaret's spare room twice a year when his circuit brought him through their part of Ohio. He was a cheerful, distracted man who left things everywhere. Reading glasses, hat pins, railway schedules. And on the morning he checked out, he had left the previous week's Denver Frontier Gazette on the kitchen table next to his coffee cup. Margaret had not yet come downstairs. Elena had set his dishes aside to wash and almost swept the paper directly into the bin, but something made her unfold it first. She was looking at the agricultural reports on the back page. She sometimes read whatever print happened to be in front of her, a small private luxury that cost nothing, when the small advertisement in the lower right corner caught her eye. Rancher, 28, seeks wife. Colorado Territory, 12 miles east of the Gunnison River. No fortune offered. No pretense made. I can provide shelter, honest work, and respect. I am looking for a woman with courage and a willing heart. Fair treatment guaranteed. Letters held in care of the Millhaven General Store. Ask for Cole Bennett. Elena read it 3 times. Then she heard Margaret's feet on the stairs, that particular heavy, deliberate footfall that meant the day's inventory of Elena's inadequacies was about to begin, and Elena folded the newspaper and slipped it under her apron against her ribs and stood at the sink with her hands in the dishwater before Margaret reached the bottom step. She did not examine what she had done, not yet. She was afraid that if she thought about it directly, she would talk herself out of it before it could become anything real. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, and the house had settled into its particular silence, the kind that felt less like peace and more like a held breath, Elena sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread flat in front of her, a sheet of her only good writing paper, and the stub of a pencil she had been rationing for 6 months. She sat for a long time without writing anything. She thought about what she knew, which was this. She had no money. She had no relations who would take her in. She had an 18th birthday that had come and gone without a single person acknowledging it, not even in passing. She had a list of 12 tasks folded in her pocket. She had a body that ached in 5 specific places from the week's work, and she had the reasonable certainty that next week would produce its own aches in 5 more. She thought about what she didn't know, which was almost everything about a man named Cole Bennett, who lived 12 miles east of the Gunnison River and was looking for a woman with courage and a willing heart. She picked up the pencil. "Dear Mr. Bennett," she wrote, and then stopped. She thought about lying, about presenting herself as something more composed, more accomplished, more settled than she actually was. She thought about what a more experienced woman might say. What kind of letter would seem most appealing to a man who had advertised for a wife in a newspaper? Then she thought, he said he didn't want pretense. He had written that word specifically. No pretense made. She started again. "Dear Mr. Bennett, I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Denver Frontier Gazette. My name is Elena Whitmore, and I am 18 years old. I live in Ohio currently, though I have no particular attachment to it. I will tell you the truth about myself because you asked for honesty, and because I have no energy left for anything else. I have no money and no family willing to claim me. I know how to work, how to cook, clean, mend, garden, and manage a household under difficult circumstances. I'm not afraid of hard work. I have never been to Colorado, but I'm not afraid of that either. I cannot promise you anything except that I will not lie to you, and I will not quit when things get difficult. I understand if this letter does not meet your requirements, but if courage and a willing heart count for something, I believe I have both. Sincerely, Elena Whitmore." She sealed the letter before she could revise it into something safer. She mailed it the following morning, walking 3 miles to the post office before Margaret woke, and she told herself as she dropped it into the mail slot that she was only exploring a possibility, that nothing might come of it, that she would not think about it again. She thought about it constantly for 11 days. His reply came on a Wednesday. It was the kind of letter that a man clearly wrote with some difficulty, not because he was unintelligent, but because he was unused to making himself legible on paper. The handwriting was slow and careful, the sentences spare, with nothing wasted. He said he had received several letters in response to the advertisement. He said hers was the only one that didn't seem to be selling him something. He said he was a cattle rancher, that he had built the ranch himself over 6 years starting from a land grant and $300, that he had no mother or father living and no siblings, and that the arrangement he was proposing was an honest one, a marriage in full legal standing, a partner on the ranch, fair treatment, and the understanding that neither of them was going into this with romantic illusions that would only cause disappointment later. Then, at the bottom of the page, below his signature, he had added a single line that he had not crossed out, but that she could tell he had almost crossed out because the pencil line beside it was still faintly visible. The advertisement said I was looking for courage. I think it takes a certain kind of courage to write a letter like yours. Elena read that line 4 times. She wrote back the same evening. Over the following 6 weeks, they exchanged 7 letters. With each exchange, something shifted incrementally, not toward romance exactly, but toward recognition. Cole described the ranch in concrete, undecorated terms. The cabin he'd expanded twice, the cattle herd, the winter feed stores, the long miles between his property and the nearest town. He described the Colorado landscape with the specific affection of a man who lived hard inside it and had come to terms with what it required. He mentioned once that the winters were brutal and that he would not lie to her about that. She told him about Ohio. She did not tell him everything about Margaret, not yet. But she told him enough that he would understand why she was not writing from a position of comfort. She told him she was not afraid of cold, that she had spent 3 winters in a house where Margaret kept the heat low as a matter of economy, and that she had a strong suspicion she could handle whatever Colorado had to offer. His response to that came faster than usual. "You sound like someone who would do fine here. I think you should come." She sat with that sentence for 2 days. Then she wrote, "I'll be on the westbound train leaving Cincinnati on the 14th. If that's too soon, tell me now." He wrote back with a single line, "I'll meet you in Millhaven." She did not tell Margaret. That was the part she had the most difficulty with, not the logistics of leaving, which were nearly nothing, since she owned nothing worth packing except 2 dresses, her good boots, and the small tin of her mother's sewing supplies that Margaret had always treated as community property. The difficulty was the knowledge of what Margaret would say, not because it would hurt her exactly, but because she could already hear it so clearly in her head that it seemed almost redundant to actually endure it. She packed in the early morning hours of the 13th, moving quietly through the house with the particular practiced silence of someone who had always been careful not to disturb the larger life happening around her. She put her things in the old carpet bag that had belonged to her mother and had been sitting in the cellar for 12 years, and she placed on the kitchen table, weighted down by the sugar bowl, a note that said only, "I have gone west. I am grateful for the years of shelter. I wish you well. Elena." She almost wrote thank you. She stood there for a long moment, pencil hovering. She put the pencil down and left the note as it was. She walked to the train station in the dark. But the train was nothing like she had imagined, and she had been careful not to imagine it too specifically, knowing her imagination would construct something that reality would only disappoint. What she had not expected was the particular quality of motion, the way the countryside simply rolled away from her in every direction as the train gathered speed, as if the world itself was agreeing to let her go. Ohio fell away. Indiana opened up and fell away too. She watched it happen from the window with her carpetbag wedged between her feet and her hands folded in her lap, and she felt something she could not name precisely, but that came closest to the sensation of an extremely long breath finally being released. She ate the bread and hard cheese she had packed. She slept in her seat for short intervals, waking each time the train slowed at a station, checking instinctively that the carpetbag was still there. The women in the seats near her were traveling in pairs, or with husbands, or with older children. Nobody spoke to her. She was fine with that. She crossed into Missouri in the gray of early morning, and Kansas by afternoon, and somewhere past the middle of Kansas, the landscape changed so completely and so suddenly that she pressed her forehead against the glass and stared. She had never seen anything so flat and so enormous. Back home, there were always trees crowding the horizon, always something to interrupt the sky. Here the sky was the main event, and the ground was just what held it up. It made her feel very small in a way that was somehow not unpleasant, just honest. By the time the Rocky Mountains appeared on the 3rd morning, rising from the flat plain like something that had been there all along just waiting to be noticed, Elena had run out of words for what she was feeling. She sat very still and watched them get larger. She thought, I wrote a letter to a stranger in Colorado, and he wrote back, and I got on a train, and the mountains are real. She was terrified, and she was not sorry, and she did not want to go back. Millhaven was smaller than she'd expected, and she had expected small. It was a main street, essentially, a hardware store, a general store, a feed and grain, a post office the size of a large closet, a saloon that looked like it had opinions about its own dignity, and a scattering of houses going off in 2 directions. The train depot was a single platform with a roof over it and 2 wooden benches, and Elena stepped off the train into the particular smell of dust and horse and something she couldn't identify, but that smelled like the West had decided to identify itself immediately. She stood on the platform with her carpetbag and looked around. She had no idea what Cole Bennett looked like. His letters had not mentioned it, and she had not asked, because asking felt like she was checking to see if he was acceptable, and that seemed like the wrong way to begin something built on honesty. Now she stood on a train platform in Colorado trying to figure out which of the 3 men she could see was the one who had written her those letters. One was old, white-haired, reading a paper on the bench. One was clearly the station master, moving luggage with a dolly. The third was standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, looking in her direction but not yet committed to looking directly at her, like a man who was trying to be ready but hadn't quite finished getting there. He was tall and built the way outdoor work builds people, not elaborate, just solid, like something that had been tested repeatedly and had held. His face was weathered in the particular way of someone who spent most of his life outside without thinking about it, and he had dark eyes that were doing something careful and concentrated when they finally met hers. She walked toward him. He did not look away. "Mr. Bennett," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was lower than she'd somehow expected. He held out his hand and she shook it. A real handshake, not the careful thing men sometimes offered women like they were worried about breaking something. "You made it." "I made it," she said. There was a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was also not the wrong kind of uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had said everything they needed to say in letters and were now working out what to say in person, which turned out to be a different problem entirely. "I've got the wagon outside," Cole said. "Ranch is about 40 minutes. If you need to get anything at the store first, we can do that." "I'm fine," she said. "I don't need anything." He nodded and picked up her carpet bag. Without asking, just did it. And she followed him off the platform. The 40 minutes to the ranch was mostly quiet. Cole was not, she discovered quickly, a man who talked to fill silence. He drove the wagon with the same economy he brought to everything else, and when he did speak, it was to say something specific. The name of a nearby peak, the approximate depth of the river crossing they'd need to make. The fact that winter had been bad this year and the road would probably stay mudky through May. She answered when he spoke. When he didn't, she watched the landscape and tried to understand what she had gotten herself into. What she could see, mostly, was that it was large. The scale of everything here was different from home, in a way she kept needing to recalibrate. The mountains in the distance were not decoration. They were a fact, like weather, something that bore directly on daily life in ways she couldn't yet calculate. The sky was doing something complicated with clouds that looked like it might mean rain later, or might mean nothing at all. "You said in your last letter you weren't afraid of the cold," Cole said, without looking at her. "Was that true, or were you trying to sound capable?" She looked at him. "Bit of both, maybe." He made a sound that might have been something close to a laugh. "Fair enough. Is it that cold? Winters here are not polite about it," he said. "But the cabin's solid. We built it, right?" "We," she noticed. He'd said we. She wondered who he'd built it with, but something told her it wasn't the right moment to ask. When the ranch came into view, she took it in without speaking. The cabin was low and wide, built from dark timber with a covered porch running along the front. There was a barn, bigger than the cabin, and several outbuildings she couldn't identify yet. The cattle she could hear before she could see them, somewhere beyond the fence line. The whole property had the look of something that had been worked at for years. Not finished, because nothing like this was ever finished, but accumulated, gradually shaped by someone who knew what they were doing and had refused to stop. "It's not much to look at," Cole said, with a flatness in his voice that she understood was not self-pity, but simply honesty, the same honesty he'd put in every letter. "It looks real," she said. "That counts for something." He turned and looked at her for a moment, actually looked at her, not the careful sideways glances he'd been managing since the platform. Then he nodded once and brought the wagon to a stop. They were married 3 days later by the circuit judge who came through Millhaven on the first Thursday of every month. The ceremony was in the judge's office, which smelled of tobacco and old paper, and lasted approximately 11 minutes. Cole wore his good shirt. Elena wore her better dress, the blue one with the collar she had mended twice. There were 2 witnesses, Thomas Greer from the feed and grain, who knew Cole from years of business, and Thomas's wife, Ruth, who had come along because she said she liked to see things done properly. Ruth pressed Elena's hand before the judge started talking and said quietly, "He's a good man. I've known him 8 years and he's never been anything but." Elena had held on to that. The judge asked the words. They said the words back. And then they were married, and the judge stamped a paper, and Thomas shook Cole's hand, and Ruth hugged Elena like she meant it, and they drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the light going gold across the mountains. "I know this isn't what most women picture," Cole said, somewhere on the road back. He said it looking straight ahead, both hands on the reins. I want you to know I understand that. I didn't picture much, Elena said. I just knew I needed to go somewhere that was different from where I was. A pause. Did it work out? The different? She looked at the mountains in the distance, enormous and still. So far, she said. He didn't say anything, but something in his shoulders shifted, a fraction of loosening, like a man who had been holding something carefully and had just found out he could set it down. The first weeks were a curriculum in everything she didn't know. Elena had always worked hard, but she had worked hard in the specific, contained way of household labor. Tasks with clear beginnings and endings, performed inside four walls, in the same order every day. Ranch work was different. Ranch work was a moving, outdoor, weather-dependent enterprise that constantly shifted its requirements and had no patience for anyone who needed to be told what to do next. She burned the biscuits 3 mornings in a row because the stove drafted differently than she was used to. She misjudged the weight of the water buckets from the well and sloshed half the contents down her front before she got the balance right. She went into the barn alone on the 4th day to begin mucking the stalls. She had decided independently that this was something she could handle. And Cole found her 20 minutes later, working methodically through the second stall with her jaw set and her dress already ruined, and he stood in the barn doorway for a moment before he said, "You could have asked me which stalls needed doing first." "I figured I'd start at the beginning and work through," she said. "You started at the end. These are the clean ones." She stopped, looked at the stall, looked at him. "You could have told me when you saw me go in." "I was going to," he said. "You were already halfway through." There was a beat of silence. Then Elena did something she hadn't expected herself to do. She laughed. Not the polished, apologetic kind of laugh that was really just a way of managing embarrassment. A real laugh, short and slightly rueful, that acknowledged the full absurdity of the situation. Cole's mouth twitched. "Show me which ones actually need doing," she said. He showed her. After that, she stopped pretending to know things she didn't know and started asking. It was harder than it sounded. 12 years of Margaret's voice telling her that not knowing things was the same as being inadequate had left its mark. But Cole received her questions without condescension, answered them plainly, and never mentioned the topic again once it was settled. It was, she discovered, possible to learn things in an environment where making mistakes was treated as information rather than evidence of fundamental deficiency. She learned the stalls and the feeding schedule and the rhythm of the cattle. She learned the stove's temperament and how to compensate for the altitude in her bread. She learned which outbuildings held what and how to read the sky for weather and where Cole kept the emergency medical kit, because on the ranch, she quickly understood, there was no running to the doctor for every small crisis. The small crises had to be handled here, with what was available. She asked Cole once, toward the end of the 3rd week, where he had learned everything he knew. She phrased it carefully because she had picked up by then that he was not a man who talked easily about his past. Not because he was hiding it, but because he had lived in his own company for so long that the past felt like a private room. "Mostly by getting it wrong first," he said. "That's how I'm learning," she said. "Then you're doing fine," he said, and went back to what he was doing. And Elena stood there for a moment with the strange, displaced feeling of someone who had just been given something she hadn't known she was waiting for. The neighbor who came closest to something like friendship was a woman named Ada Hargrove, whose husband ranched the land 2 miles east and who had a way of appearing at the door with a covered dish whenever the weather suggested someone nearby might be struggling. She was perhaps 45, with iron-gray hair and the brisk practicality of someone who had decided a long time ago that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford in large quantities, though it occasionally leaked out around the edges. Ada came the first time on a Saturday in mid-April with a crock of bean soup, introduced herself without ceremony, and looked Elena up and down with the frank assessment of someone who had seen mail-order brides come and go from this valley and had developed opinions about which ones would last. "Cole's a solitary man," Ada said, sitting at the kitchen table with her soup and the coffee Elena had made as quickly as she could. "Some women can't stand that. They think they can change it." "I don't mind solitary," Elena said. "I grew up in a house where the person who talked most had the least worth saying." Ada looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. "You'll do fine," she said, exactly as Ruth had at the wedding, and Elena understood that in this valley, this was a specific thing that specific women said when they meant it. After that, Ada came every 2 weeks or so, always with food, always with the latest information about what was happening in the surrounding ranches. Information delivered not as gossip, but as practical intelligence, the kind of knowledge a new person in a community needed in order to function. She told Elena which families were struggling and might need help. She told her which merchants in Millhaven dealt honestly. She told her about the valley's history, the hard winters, the families who had left, the ones who had stayed, and what had kept them. "What kept you?" Elena asked once. Ada was quiet for a moment. "Same thing that keeps most people in hard places," she said. "You put enough of yourself into something. Leaving it starts to feel like leaving yourself behind." Elena thought about Ohio. She thought about the kitchen table where she had spent 12 years serving someone else's life. She thought about Cole's letters and the train platform and the wagon road winding through the mountains in the afternoon light. "I think I understand that," she said. The moment she understood that something had genuinely changed between her and Cole happened on a Thursday evening in late May, so quietly that she almost missed it. She had been sick for 2 days. Nothing dramatic, just a persistent fever and exhaustion that she had tried to work through, and that Cole had finally intervened in by telling her plainly that she was to stay in bed and not argue about it, a command she had resisted until her legs gave him the argument for her. She had spent the day in the cabin while Cole worked the ranch alone, and she had lain there listening to the sounds of the place, the cattle, the wind, the specific creak of the floorboards in the barn that she had come to recognize as belonging to this particular building and no other. And she had felt the strange, slightly unsettling sensation of being in a place that had begun to feel like hers. In the evening, Cole had come inside and, without saying anything about it, made a simple supper and brought it to her where she was sitting up in bed with a book she was too tired to read, and set the plate on the small table beside her and turned to go. "Cole," she said. He turned. "Thank you," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The evening light came in through the window and made a long shape across the floor. "You'd do the same," he said. Not as a compliment exactly, just as a statement of what he had observed to be true. She thought, "I would." That was the moment. Not the wedding, not the first week or the first month, not the first time she had made him laugh properly, which had happened on a Tuesday 3 weeks in when she had described, with a degree of editorialized precision, the look on a particular cow's face as it reconsidered a fence it had decided to challenge. The moment was simpler than any of those. It was the recognition that they had, without planning it, begun to operate as if each other's well-being was a thing they were responsible for. That was not romance exactly, not yet. It was something older than romance, more functional, more structural. It was what you built first when you were building something real. She ate the supper. It was not fancy, it was adequate and warm and present, and it was enough. June brought the first of the summer storms, and with it a crisis that arrived sideways, the way ranch crises always seem to, not announced, not gradually escalating, just suddenly there. Cole had ridden out at mid-morning to check the east fence line, where 2 of the cattle had been testing the posts. Elena had stayed back to work in the kitchen garden, and she had been watching the sky in the northwest the way she was learning to watch it, not casually, but with the active attention of someone who had come to understand that the sky in Colorado had opinions it expressed emphatically. The storm came faster than she had thought storms came. By the time the first wall of wind hit the property, she had gotten the garden tools into the shed and secured the hen house, but the barn door was still open. She could see it from the garden, swinging loose on its upper hinge, the one that Cole had been meaning to repair and hadn't gotten to yet. She ran for it. The wind was doing something active and disagreeable with the rain, driving it sideways, and by the time she reached the barn, she was soaked through and the door was swinging hard, banging against the frame with a force that she could feel in her teeth. She got a grip on the door and pulled. It resisted. The upper hinge was not just loose, it was now actively bending in the wrong direction under the wind's pressure. She planted her feet and pulled harder. A corner of her mind registered that this was probably not the smartest thing she had ever done, fighting a heavy door in a Colorado thunderstorm. But the alternative was letting the storm into the barn, where the horses were making their opinions about the situation very clear in a loud and agitated way. She got the door closed. She found a length of rope on the wall and lashed the handle to the post beside it. In the particular knot Cole had shown her 3 weeks ago for exactly this kind of contingency. And then she stood in the barn doorway with the rain hammering down and her hand shaking from the effort, and looked out at the property she had been here barely 2 months and already felt responsible for. Cole came back an hour later, wet to the skin, to find her in the kitchen with dry clothes and the stove lit and a pot of coffee going. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and then at the barn, where the rope she'd tied was still holding the door in place. "You tied off the barn," he said. "The hinge went," she said. "I used the figure 8 knot." A beat. "You remembered the knot. You showed me 3 weeks ago. I paid attention." Cole stood there for a moment with the water dripping off his hat onto the porch floor. There was something moving through his expression that she was learning to read but didn't yet have a full name for, something that came up in him when she did things he hadn't asked her to do, things he hadn't thought to prepare her for, that she had done anyway because they needed doing. "I'll fix the hinge tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "Coffee's hot." He came inside. She found her footing slowly, and not without stumbling, and not without occasional nights when she lay awake in the dark listening to the cattle settle and the mountains hold their enormous silence, wondering what she would do if this turned out to be a mistake. If the version of herself she was building here turned out to be built on sand, if something collapsed that she couldn't see yet. But there were other nights. There were nights when the sky over the ranch was so full of stars it looked like something someone had invented to make a point about scale, and she would stand on the porch and look up at it and feel the specific quality of being exactly where she was, in exactly this body, at exactly this moment, a feeling so different from the flatness of Ohio, from the gray daily erasure of Margaret's house, that it was hard to believe they existed in the same world. There were evenings when Cole came in from the range and sat across the table from her and talked, really talked, with a specificity and seriousness that she was coming to understand was what he offered instead of easy sociability. The depth and place of the width. He told her about the cattle and what he was planning for the fall, and about the Hargroves and the complicated land history of the valley, and once, with a carefulness that she heard and did not push against, about his mother, who had died when he was born, and his father, who had raised him silently in the grief of that loss until his own death, when Cole was 19, leaving him the land grant and $300 and nothing else. "That must have been a lonely way to grow up," she said. "It was what it was," he said. And then after a moment, "You?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "Different kind, but yes." He nodded slowly. Neither of them said anything for a while. The fire in the stove spoke for them, and the wind outside, and the cattle settling for the night. This, she thought, was also something they were building. Not just the ranch, not just the routine of shared labor and shared meals, and the practical daily architecture of a life together. Something quieter and harder to name that was being assembled out of these small moments of mutual recognition, the way you assemble a wall out of stones, one at a time, nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of what holds. She was afraid to name it too directly. She was afraid if she named it, she might do something to disturb it. She let it be what it was, and she showed up the next morning and the morning after that, and did what needed doing, and paid attention, and slowly, haltingly, imperfectly, in the particular way of two people who had both been damaged by the specific loneliness of their own histories, they began to find their way toward something that neither of them had quite allowed themselves to hope for. She was not sure yet what to call it. But the mountains were real, and the ranch was real, and Cole Bennett was real, and she had written a letter to a stranger and gotten on a train and crossed half the country, and she was here. She was here. The summer Cole Bennett's north fence finally gave out. He and Elena fixed it together in a single afternoon, and neither of them mentioned that 6 months earlier he would have ridden out to do it alone without it occurring to him that there was another option. That was how most things changed between them, not with announcement, not with any moment you could point to and say, there. That was the turning point, but gradually, the way light changes in a room when the season shifts and the angle of the sun moves by degrees, until one morning you realize the room is lit differently than it used to be, and you cannot remember exactly when that happened. The fence repair took most of the day. Cole pulled posts while Elena held the wire taut, and they worked in the particular silence that had become their default register. Not uncomfortable, not strained, just the silence of two people who had discovered that they didn't need noise to fill the space between them. When they finished and stood back to look at what they'd done, Cole said, "Good." And Elena said, "The third post from the left is still a little loose." And Cole looked at it for a moment and said, "You're right," and went back and reset it. Small things. But she had learned that small things were how you read a life. By midsummer, she had stopped bracing for some version of what she'd had in Ohio, stopped waiting for the moment when the arrangement would reveal its actual terms, when the politeness would harden into the same tired transaction she'd spent 12 years inside. It didn't harden. Cole was not a man who operated in hidden terms. What he had put in his letters was what she got every morning, a man who worked hard, kept his word, treated her as someone whose judgment was worth consulting, and had a dry, understated humor that appeared without warning at unexpected intervals and made her laugh in a way she hadn't remembered she was capable of. He was also, she was learning, a man with a specific grief he kept to the side of everything. The way you keep an injury from an old wound. Not hidden exactly, but not displayed, managed, integrated into daily function at the cost of a certain constant background effort. She didn't push it. She recognized it from the inside. You didn't push things like that. You waited, and you made yourself someone worth trusting with it. And eventually, if you were patient and consistent, it came to you on its own terms. In the meantime, she had a ranch to learn. Ada Hargrove had taken on something close to the role of practical instructor in Elena's education in frontier ranching. Not formally, not with any declared arrangement, but in the way that capable older women in small communities often teach younger ones, by working alongside them and letting the knowledge transfer through proximity. Ada would arrive on a Tuesday, and they would spend the morning putting up preserves, and Elena would learn the specific logic of frontier food storage, not from instructions, but from watching Ada's hands and asking the right questions. Ada taught her which wild herbs grew on the hillsides above the property and what they were good for. She taught her the valley's social geography, who was reliable, who was not, who was going through a difficult season and could use an extra hand without being asked directly. Elena was a quick study, and Ada said so. Once. "You don't say it twice," Elena observed. "If you've heard it once, you don't need to hear it twice," Ada said. "And if you need to hear it twice, you won't believe it the second time either." Elena thought about that for a while. "My aunt used to say I was slow." "Your aunt was wrong," Ada said without particular heat, in the tone of someone stating a fact about soil composition. Elena turned back to the preserves and did not say anything, but something in her chest settled that had been faintly unsettled for years, and she thought, that is what it sounds like when someone says a true thing plainly. The Hargrove men, Ada's husband Bernard and their 2 grown sons, were the kind of neighbors that made a difficult country feel possible. Bernard had been ranching this valley for 23 years and had a practical knowledge of the land's specific cruelties and specific generosities that was worth more than any almanac. He and Cole had the easy, functional relationship of 2 men who had worked alongside each other long enough to know where the other one's edges were and respected them without needing to discuss it. The Hargrove sons, Will and Tom, were younger. Will was 22, Tom was 19, and they were good workers and reasonably decent company and treated Elena with the straightforward respect that their mother had clearly required of them since childhood. The first time Will helped Cole repair the barn roof, a 2-man job that Cole had been putting off because it genuinely couldn't be done by one, Elena made lunch for all of them and brought it out to the barn, and afterward Will said to Cole, in the particular offhand way of men who didn't know how to give compliments directly, "Your wife makes good cornbread." Cole looked at Elena across the space between them and said, without a beat, "I know." She had walked back into the cabin before he could see that she was smiling. Later that evening, when he came in to wash up, she said, "You didn't have to say that." "I know," he said. "So why did you?" He dried his hands and looked at her in the direct, considered way he had when he was deciding whether something was worth saying out loud. "Because it's true," he said, "and because Will needed to hear it. She processed that. You were defending me. I was just saying what's accurate. That's the same thing. He thought about it. Maybe, he said. She didn't push it further, but she filed it carefully in the place where she kept the things she was beginning to understand about Cole Bennett, and she thought, he is not a man who says things he doesn't mean, which means every single thing he said he meant. That was a significant piece of information. It changed the way she listened to him. The work of the ranch through August was relentless in the particular way of summer ranch work, not cruel but constant, a steady daily demand that left your body tired in a way that was earned and therefore not the same as the exhaustion of Ohio, which had been the exhaustion of futility. Here the tiredness had a point. You fell asleep at night knowing exactly what you had produced, what the day's effort had built toward, and you woke in the morning knowing what the next days would build toward. And the accumulation of those days was something you could actually see in the pastures and the gardens, and the preserved stores lining the cellar shelves. Elena discovered that she was good at things she hadn't known she was good at. She was good at the garden. Better than Cole, who grew things through force of practical will, but had no particular instinct for it. She had an eye for what the plants needed, a sensitivity to the small signs of stress or disease that, caught early, were manageable. She expanded the kitchen garden in July, added a section for root vegetables Cole hadn't grown before, and he watched her do it and said nothing. And when the turnips came in thick in September, he looked at them for a long moment and said, "Didn't know this soil would take that." "I amended it," she said. "The southwest corner drains fast. I put in some compost from the barn." "When did you do that?" "Back in June, when you were fixing the water line." He looked at her with that expression she was learning to read, the one that appeared when she had done something he hadn't expected. Not surprised exactly, more like recalibrating. "You've been planning this since June," he said. "I've been planning a few things since June," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. "Should I ask what else?" "Probably better if you just wait and see." He shook his head slightly, and this time the almost smile became a real one, brief and lopsided, gone before it had fully arrived, and Elena thought, there it is. She was falling in love with him, and she was not going to say so yet, because saying it too soon was how you frightened a solitary man, and she had not come this far to be careless with the most important thing she had. The autumn came early that year, the way the valley winters apparently announced themselves, with an abruptness that reminded everyone what the stakes were. Bernard Hargrove rode by in the first week of September with a look on his face that Elena had not seen before and that Cole clearly recognized immediately, because he put down what he was doing and walked out to meet Bernard at the gate. "Early winter," Bernard said. "Saw it in the peaks. Storm sign." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "How early?" "Before October's out, if it follows the pattern. Maybe sooner." Elena stood on the porch and watched them talk and understood, from the set of their shoulders and the economy of their words, that this was not casual weather conversation. This was a risk assessment. She thought about the winter stores, about what was still needed, about the cattle and the feed supply and the half-dozen preparations she had been meaning to bring up with Cole when a good moment presented itself. She went inside and made a list. When Cole came back in, she was sitting at the table with the list in front of her. He looked at it. She pushed it across the table toward him. He read through it. "How long have you been keeping track of this?" he said. 3 weeks, she said. "I didn't want to bring it up without being sure I had the numbers right." He read through the list again. "You've got it right," he said, "but you're missing the feed estimate for the second herd. I think we're about 20% short." "Then we need to go to Millhaven," she said. "This week." "This week," he agreed. They went to Millhaven on Thursday. The general store was already busy with ranchers who had received the same early winter news and were making the same calculations, and Elena spent 2 hours with Cole moving through the store's inventory with the list, adjusting, substituting, making decisions that she had the information to make now in a way she had not had in June. Thomas Greer, who ran the store, caught her eye at one point and said, "You've settled in," in a tone that wasn't a compliment exactly, but was something more specific. It was recognition, the acknowledgement that she was here and functioning and not one of the ones who had left. "I'm trying to," she said. "You're past trying," he said, and turned back to his inventory. Cole heard that exchange. He didn't say anything about it until they were loading the wagon, and then he said, without looking up from what he was doing, "Greer doesn't say things like that to people who haven't earned it." "I know," she said. She could feel him looking at her then, even though she had her back to him, shifting a sack of grain. She didn't turn around. She let the moment be what it was. They drove home in the late afternoon, the wagon heavy with supplies, the mountains turning their particular evening amber, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the silence was the specific kind that comes when two people are carrying the same thought, and neither of them is sure yet who should say it first. Cole said it first. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "When I placed that advertisement," he said carefully, "I was looking for something practical, a working arrangement. I want you to know that I understood that was what I was asking for, and that I didn't expect anything more than that." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you that because what I want now is different from what I was asking for then," he said. "And I don't think it's fair to let that sit without saying it plainly." She looked at him. He was looking at the road, hands on the reins, doing the thing he did when the words were difficult, keeping his eyes somewhere external so that the internal work had room to happen. "What do you want now?" she said. A pause. The wagon wheels on the road. The mountains going amber. "More than an arrangement," he said. It was not poetry. It was not even particularly romantic, delivered in Cole Bennett's flat, careful voice on a wagon bench with a load of winter grain behind them. But it was true, and he had said it plainly, and she had learned by now that plainly said and truly meant was worth more than beautiful words that came from habit. "Me too," she said. He finally looked at her. There was something in his face that she recognized because she'd felt it herself. Relief, mostly, at having said the thing and had it land safely. They drove the rest of the way home in a different kind of silence than the one they'd set out with. That night he made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table for longer than was strictly necessary for anything, talking about the winter preparations and the cattle and the root vegetables and the fence line that would need attention in the spring. And Elena thought, this is what we are. Not two people who came together out of desperation and made the best of it. Something else. Something that started as a practical arrangement and built itself day by day into a thing I don't have a good word for yet. She thought she might find the word eventually. She thought she had time. She was right about the early winter. The first hard frost arrived on October the 3rd, which was earlier than Cole had seen it in 5 years on this land. Elena woke to it, or rather, she woke to Cole already up and dressed, and moving through the cabin with a specific purposeful urgency that immediately communicated that something had shifted in the night. She dressed fast and came out to find him checking the water line at the back of the cabin, the one that ran from the well, and she already knew without asking what the concern was. "Line freeze?" she said. "Not yet, but the temperature dropped faster than I expected. I need to check the cattle. I'll get the stove hot and start on the water supply. How much do we need stored before you go?" He looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks," she said. "Ada told me what the first frost means for the water line. I was hoping we'd have another week." "So was I," he said. They divided the morning's work without discussion, each taking the piece of it they were best positioned to handle. Cole rode out to the cattle. Elena stoked the stove to maximum heat, insulated the water line with the heavy fabric she had prepared in advance and stored in the cellar, brought in the last of the root vegetables from the garden, and had a full pot of water heating and the cabin sealed against the draft before Cole returned an hour later. "Cattle are fine," he said, coming in and shedding his coat. "Lost 2 water troughs to freeze, guys. I'll need to get them thawed before noon." "I've got hot water," she said. He stopped. "You heated extra water." "I heated a lot of extra water," she said. "Also the cornbread's in the oven. Eat something before you go back out." He sat down at the table with the look of a man who was still calibrating his understanding of something. He ate the cornbread without speaking. She poured him coffee and went back to the stove. "Elena," he said. I just want to say," he started and then stopped, and she could hear him working through whatever it was. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. I want to." She turned from the stove and looked at him. He was sitting at the table with both hands around the coffee cup, looking at her with an expression that was not comfortable for him. She could see it cost him something to have his face open like that. This man who had been in his own company for so long, but he was doing it anyway. "I'm glad you wrote that letter," he said. "I need you to know that." She held that for a moment. "I'm glad you wrote back," she said. He nodded once, looked down at his coffee, and the moment closed as simply as it had opened. He finished his coffee, put his coat back on, and went out to thaw the water troughs. Elena turned back to the stove and stood there for a minute, not doing anything, just being in the moment. Then she went back to work. The early winter proved itself over the following weeks. November came in cold and stayed that way. The kind of cold that was not theatrical about itself but was simply present, a constant background condition that the entire operation of the ranch had to accommodate. Elena learned what winter ranching actually meant. The doubled labor, the shortened daylight, the particular calculation of every calorie and cord of wood and stored resource that would need to last until spring. She had read about hard winters. Reading about them and living inside one were categorically different experiences. She did not complain. She had not come here to complain. And the cold, for all its difficulty, had a clarity about it that she did not find objectionable. Everything was reduced to what mattered. You focused on what mattered, and you did what needed doing, and you got through it. And there was a simplicity to that imperative that she found, unexpectedly, more congenial than Ohio's gray, complicated dreariness had ever been. Cole watched her navigate the winter with a quiet attention that she was aware of, but didn't address directly. He adjusted their routines to make the hardest parts more manageable, not out of any policy of coddling, but out of the simple logistics of two people working in concert towards survival. And she did the same for him, and without either of them naming it, they had become by December something that a neutral observer might look at and recognize as a partnership in the fullest sense. The blizzard that changed everything came in the third week of January. It did not announce itself in the way Elena had come to expect severe weather to announce itself. There was no particular morning warning, no dramatic shift in the sky that made you stop and look. Cole had ridden out after breakfast to check on the eastern cattle, the herd that pastured in the lower field, which had been drifting closer to the fence line in ways that made him uneasy, and Elena had stayed in to work on the winter sowing she'd been putting off. She noticed the temperature drop at mid-morning, but temperature drops in January were not unusual. She noticed the wind picking up, but wind was not unusual. She went to the window and looked out and saw something she had not seen before. The particular quality of light going flat and white in the northwest in a way that was different from ordinary cloud cover, a kind of absolute whitening that made the air between the cabin and the barn look somehow thicker than usual. She went outside. The wind hit her like a shove. She had been outside in winter winds before. This was different. This wind had weight and direction and intention, and the cold riding inside it was a different species of cold than she had experienced. Not the ordinary January cold that made you wrap your coat tighter, but something that found the edges of your clothing and went through them, that pressed against exposed skin with a specific physical force. She looked northwest. The sky was gone. What was coming down from the peaks was not a storm in the ordinary sense. It was a wall, a moving, solid mass of white that was consuming the visible world from the northwest in every direction, and it was moving faster than she had expected things of that scale to move. She went back inside and put on every layer she had. Cole had been gone for 2 hours. She stood at the window and watched the white wall get closer and thought, with a calm that surprised her in retrospect, he is out there in that. The blizzard hit the ranch property at approximately 11:30. In 3 minutes, the barn disappeared. In 5 minutes, she could not see the fence line. In 10 minutes, there was nothing outside the windows but white, moving, absolute white, and the wind was hitting the cabin with a sustained pressure that made the timber shift and groan in ways that would have frightened her more if she had not been occupied with the singular fact that Cole Bennett had ridden east 2 hours ago and had not come back. She waited. She did what could be done in the cabin, stoked the stove to the maximum the wood supply would support, brought in additional firewood from the covered stack on the porch before it became inaccessible, inventoried what she had, laid out the medical kit on the table because some part of her was already thinking about what might be needed. And she waited. An hour passed. She stood at the window and looked at nothing but white and felt something that she was honest enough with herself to name. It was fear. Not the low-grade fear of Ohio, not the anxious vigilance of a life spent managing someone's displeasure. This was different. This was clean and specific and had a precise object. She was afraid for Cole. She was afraid in the way you were afraid for someone when you had stopped thinking of them as separate from yourself in the most important ways, when the distance between my well-being and their well-being had collapsed into something singular. She had not expected 6 months ago on a train platform in Mill Haven to feel this way about the quiet rancher who had met her with his hat in his hands and not looked away. But she felt it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise even to herself. She waited another 30 minutes. Then she put on every piece of warm clothing she owned, layered one on top of another, wrapped her head and face in the heavy wool scarf that Ada had given her in November. "You'll need this more than you think," tied a length of rope to the porch post and coiled the rest over her shoulder, and went into the blizzard to find her husband. The cold was an assault. The wind was a wall she had to lean into at an angle to make progress, and the snow, not falling so much as moving horizontally, hit every exposed part of her face like needles. She could see nothing beyond 5 feet in any direction. The rope trailed behind her, her line back to the cabin, and she moved east by feel and memory, counting steps, keeping the wind direction constant against her left shoulder because east was where Cole had gone, and the wind was coming from the northwest, and she had enough geometry left in her head to use that. She found him 20 minutes from the cabin. He was down in the lee of the collapsed fence section. The same section they'd repaired together in summer. She recognized it by the particular angle of the remaining post, with his horse standing close over him in the instinctive, shelter-giving way of horses that she had no time to be moved by. Cole was on his side in the snow, his hat gone, blood on the left side of his face from a wound she couldn't assess through the snow and wind, and he was not moving. She knelt beside him and put her face close to his and said his name. His eyes opened, unfocused, found her face. "Elena," he said, thickly, like a man speaking through water. "I've got you," she said. "You have to help me. I can't carry you, so you have to help me walk." "Fence post," he said, horse spooked. "I went down—" "Later," she said. "Right now you stand up." He stood up, barely. He went to one knee twice before he was fully upright, and she had his arm over her shoulders with his weight pressing down on her in a way that was at the outer edge of what she could support, and she thought, "This is going to be the hardest thing I have ever done." She started back toward the cabin. She followed the rope. She had done a smart thing, the rope, and she knew it now in the specific way you know you've done a smart thing, when it is literally the only reason you are not lost in a whiteout with a half-conscious man leaning on you in zero visibility. She followed the rope, hand over hand, each length of it a landmark. Cole moving with her in the effortful, half-aware way of someone whose body was still operational, but whose mind was somewhere behind a wall of shock and cold. He went down once. She got him back up. She stopped counting how many steps it took. She stopped trying to estimate the distance. She just followed the rope and kept moving and did not think about anything except the next step and the weight of Cole's arm over her shoulders and the particular way his breathing sounded, labored but continuous, which meant alive, which meant keep going. The cabin porch materialized out of the white in front of her like a photograph developing. She got him inside and closed the door and felt the heat of the stove hit her face, and she stood there for 1 second, just one, with her hand on the door and Cole leaning against the wall beside her, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she took his coat off and started to work. The wound on his head was bad, a deep laceration across the left temple where the fence post had caught him, bleeding steadily in the way that head wounds bled, which looked worse than it was, but was still serious. He had hypothermia, she was nearly certain, by the behavior of his hands when she tried to get them to cooperate, the way his thinking was slow and his words came out in the wrong order. She had a kit. She had Ada's instruction from November on what the kit was for. She had the knowledge she'd been accumulating for 6 months, not because she'd planned for this exact moment, but because she had been paying attention to everything in reach since the day she arrived, and now that attention was the only thing she had. She stitched his head wound at the kitchen table, by firelight, with her hands shaking slightly from cold and aftermath, and Cole gripped the edge of the table and made a sound he immediately suppressed, and she said, "I know," and kept going, because there was nothing else to do. Afterwards, she wrapped him in every blanket in the cabin and put his hands in hers and sat close to the stove through the long hours while the blizzard hammered the walls. And she watched his color slowly return and listened to his breathing slowly normalize and thought about the letter she had written in a kitchen in Ohio on the back of one sheet of good paper with a stub of pencil. "I will not lie to you, and I will not quit when things get difficult." She had not lied. She had not quit. Around 3 a.m, Cole's eyes opened and found her face and stayed there, and this time they were clear. "You went out in that," he said. "Yes," she said. "I told you." He started and then stopped, because he knew, even as he said it, that whatever he had told her before about staying inside in bad weather had not been an instruction that was built for this situation, for the specific situation of him being out there in it. "You did," she said, "and you would have done the same." A long pause, the stove, the storm, the particular silence inside a blizzard when you are warm and the person you went into the cold for is beside you. "Yes," he said, "I would have." She squeezed his hand once. He held on. Outside, the blizzard went on doing what blizzards did, absolute and indifferent, as the Colorado winter always was, as the landscape always was. But inside the cabin, in the firelight, with Cole's hand in hers, and the color returning to his face, and the storm eventually beginning, around dawn, to ease, there was something that had been there for months in seed form finally opening into what it had always been trying to become. Not a practical arrangement, not a working agreement between two lonely people who had answered each other's advertisements in a newspaper. Something she had a word for now, finally. She kept it to herself for the moment. There was time. They had built something here together that was solid enough to hold it. She watched him sleep and kept the fire going and waited for morning. Morning came the way it always did after a bad night. Not gently, not with any particular consideration for what the people inside had been through. Just gray light pushing through the frost-edged window glass, and the stove burning low, and Cole asleep on his back with his head bandaged, and his color almost normal, which was the only thing that mattered. Elena had not slept. She had stayed in the chair beside the stove the entire night, adding wood at intervals, checking Cole's breathing, checking the wound for signs of the heat, and swelling Ada had warned her about when they'd talked in November about head injuries. Ada, who had seen 3 in her years on this ranch, and had described each one with the clinical precision of someone who had learned the hard way that sentiment didn't help you recognize infection. Elena had listened. She had filed it away with everything else she'd been filing away since June, not knowing then that she was building a medical education she would need in January at 3 a.m, alone. The wound looked clean. The swelling was present, but not worsening. His breathing through the night had been steady and deep rather than the shallow, effortful breathing that Ada had said was the thing to watch for. Around 6 a.m, he stirred, turned his head, and winced. "Don't move fast," Elena said. He stopped. "I know," he said, but carefully, in the way of a man taking inventory of his own damage before committing to any position. His hand came up toward the bandage, and she reached over and stopped it. "Leave it," she said. "How bad?" "Bad enough that you needed stitching, not bad enough that you're not going to be fine." She said this with a flatness she had borrowed from Ada's register, the tone of someone who was giving you facts rather than managing your feelings, which she had found was the tone Cole responded to best. He let his hand drop. "How long was I out?" "When I found you, you weren't fully unconscious. You knew your name. You knew mine." She paused. "You went properly under for about 20 minutes after I got you inside. Then you were in and out until around midnight. Since then, you've been sleeping straight through." He absorbed this. "The cattle are not your concern until your head is working properly," she said. "The blizzard stopped. I'll go check the barn when it's fully light." He looked at her directly then, and she saw the thing that passed through his face. Not gratitude exactly, because Cole didn't do gratitude in the straightforward way. It was more complicated than that in him. But a kind of reckoning, The look of a man who has had to update something fundamental about his understanding of a situation. "You went out in that," he said again. He had said it last night, and he was saying it again, and she understood that he was not repeating himself because he'd forgotten. He was repeating it because he was still working through what it meant. "You were out there," she said. "I could have—" He stopped. "You didn't," she said. "So let's not." A long pause. The stove. The early morning light going from gray to pale gold at the window. Outside, the world was white and silent in the way it went after a major storm, the particular muffled stillness of deep new snow. "My father always said this land would kill anyone who wasn't paying attention," Cole said. His voice was quiet, still roughed up at the edges from the night. "Your father was right," Elena said. "But you were paying attention. You just had an unlucky moment with a fence post and a frightened horse. And a wife who came out in a whiteout to haul me back." "Yes," she said. "That too." Something shifted in his face. Not the almost smile she was used to. Something quieter than that, more settled. The expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he was not going to argue with. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words, and Cole Bennett did not say things he didn't mean, so they landed the way 2 words could land when the person saying them had never once said them carelessly. Elena looked at him for a moment and then said, "Don't thank me. Just rest today and let me look at that wound again this afternoon." She got up and went to put more wood on the stove because she needed to do something with her hands, and because she had learned over 6 months of marriage that there were moments that were complete in themselves and didn't need to be made larger. That was one of them. She let it be complete. The days following the blizzard were the hardest work Elena had done since arriving at the ranch, and the work she'd done before had not been easy. The snow was deep, deeper than any she had seen, hip deep in the open areas between the cabin and the barn, and in the places where it had drifted it reached the eaves of the smaller outbuildings. Cole was confined to the cabin for the first 2 days by Elena's flat insistence and, she suspected, by the fact that his body was enforcing what she'd asked of it, whether he liked it or not. He moved carefully, and his face went tight in a specific way when he turned his head too fast, which told her the headache was still significant, even if he wasn't going to say so. So she worked the ranch. Bernard and Will Hargrove appeared on the second morning, materializing out of the white on horseback, because that was the kind of neighbors the Hargroves were. They had seen the storm, and they had known Cole was out in it when it hit, and they had come to help without being asked and without making anything of it. Bernard assessed the situation in 3 minutes and got to work. Will shoveled with Elena, while Bernard and Tom, who arrived an hour later on the second horse, dug out the buried sections of fencing and checked the cattle. 3 cattle were lost. Cole received that news from his kitchen chair with a jaw that tightened and a long silence and then a single nod, and Elena watched him absorb it the way he absorbed bad things, without drama, without complaint, with the practical grief of a man who had built something and seen it take damage and was already, even while grieving, beginning to calculate what came next. "The herd's otherwise sound," Bernard said. "The east pasture fence needs significant work come spring, but it'll hold for now with what we've patched." "I'll get out there in a couple of days," Cole said. "You'll get out there when your head is right," Elena said from the stove. Bernard looked at her with something close to approval. "She's correct," he said. Cole looked at both of them with the particular expression of a man who understood he was outvoted. "Fine," he said. Will, who was young enough to still find other people's domestic dynamics entertaining, said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. After the Hargroves left, Elena stood at the window watching them ride back north through the white landscape and felt the specific exhaustion of the past 72 hours settle into her bones all at once. The way exhaustion waits politely until there's nothing requiring your immediate attention and then arrives in full. Her back ached. Her hands had 3 new blisters from the shoveling. She had a cut on her left palm from where she had grabbed the fence wire without thinking yesterday, and it needed attention she hadn't gotten around to giving it. "Come here," Cole said from behind her. She turned. He was standing, carefully, one hand on the table, holding the medical kit, and he was looking at her hand. "I'm fine," she said. "You've been telling me that since January," he said. "Sit down." She sat. He cleaned and bandaged the cut on her palm with the same care she had given his head wound, working slowly because of his own still limited range of comfortable movement, his hands steady and deliberate. She watched him work and thought about the first weeks here, when they had been two strangers moving carefully around each other, and what it would have looked like to some other version of herself. The one sitting in Margaret's kitchen in Ohio, reading an advertisement in a borrowed newspaper. To see herself here now, in this cabin, in January, with this man's hands around hers. Unimaginable. Completely unimaginable. "Does it hurt?" he said. "No," she said, which was true of the cut, if not entirely true of the rest of her. He finished the bandage and held her hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then set it down carefully on the table as if it were something he didn't want to damage. She thought, "There is the word I found. That is exactly the word." She was still keeping it to herself, but less carefully than before. The month of February passed in the slow, grinding way that the deep part of winter passed on the frontier. Not dramatically, not with any single event that defined it, but with the steady daily pressure of cold and work and shortened light that tested you not in one decisive moment, but across hundreds of small ones. Elena had known, intellectually, that winters here were what Cole had warned her they were in his letters. Living through one was a different kind of knowing. What she had not expected was how much of it she would find she could handle, not easily, not without cost. There were mornings she stood at the stove before dawn with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, feeling the particular bone-deep tiredness of someone who had been cold for months, and wondered with complete honesty whether the warm kitchen of even Margaret's house might feel like relief. Then she would look out the window at the mountains still white and enormous in the early dark, and feel something stir in her that was not comfortable but was not nothing, more like the feeling of a muscle being tested and not failing, which was its own kind of satisfaction. Cole's wound healed cleanly. She had been watching it with an attention that she recognized was not entirely clinical. There was something personal in her investment in that wound, something that had to do with the fact that she had stitched it at a kitchen table in a blizzard and had sat beside the stove all night afterwards, and she had never in her life done anything that mattered that much in so direct and physical a way. It had shown her something about herself that she was still processing. By mid-February, the scar was settling into a pale line at his left temple that his hair mostly covered, and he had stopped favoring his head when he turned, and the headaches, which he had not admitted to but which she had read in his face every evening for 3 weeks, had finally stopped leaving their mark there. He came in one afternoon from working the east fence line, the post repairs that couldn't wait for spring, and she was at the kitchen table going over the cattle records she'd been helping him keep since October, and he said, from the doorway, "How are the numbers?" "We're going to come out of winter with the herd mostly intact," she said. "If we get a mild March, we'll be close to what you projected." He came in and sat down across from her and looked at the records the way he looked at anything that was numbers and real, with the specific focused attention of a man who had a practical relationship with information. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. He looked at what she had done and said, "You changed the column layout." "The old layout made it hard to see the weight estimates against the feed costs at a glance," she said. "I reorganized it so the comparison is visible on the same line." He studied the pages. "It's better," he said. "I know," she said. He looked up at her. She looked back at him. And the thing that passed between them in that moment was something that had no dramatic quality to it at all. It was just the simple, specific recognition of 2 people who had been paying close attention to each other for 8 months and had arrived at a place where they could see each other clearly, without the distortions of hope or anxiety or the performance of being what the other person needed. He knew what she was. She knew what he was. They were not surprised by each other anymore. That was its own kind of intimacy, and she thought it was probably more durable than the kind that arrived quickly and loudly. Spring broke in late March, the way it broke in this valley, not gradually but suddenly, as if the season had made a decision overnight. Elena walked out one morning and the air had changed. Not warm exactly, not yet, but different in temperature and smell in a way that meant something was over and something else was beginning, and she stood on the porch for a long moment, just breathing it. Cole came out behind her, stood beside her. "Spring," she said. "Finally," he said. They stood there for a moment, looking at the property, at the fence lines and the barn and the pastures going from white to pale brown as the snow pulled back, at the cattle moving differently now, with a looseness that matched the air. And Elena thought about the day she had arrived here with a carpet bag and no money and a very uncertain read on whether she had made the best or worst decision of her life. She thought about the barn door in the summer storm, the records she had reorganized, the root vegetables in the amended soil, the blizzard and the rope and Cole's hand in hers through the night. She thought, I built this too, not alone, but I built this. I need to tell you something, she said. Cole looked at her. She had been thinking about how to say it for several weeks, and in the end she had decided the only honest approach was the same one she had used in the letter. Just say it plainly and let it be what it was. I love you, she said. I've known it for a while. I didn't want to say it before you were ready to hear it, but I think we're past that now. Cole was quiet for a moment. She waited. She was good at waiting. I'm not good at saying it, he said. You know that. I know, she said. But He stopped. Try it again. Yes, he said. For a while. It was not a speech. It was not even a full sentence. But she looked at his face when he said it. The particular quality of effort and relief that was on it. The face of a man who had just laid down something he had been carrying carefully for months. And she thought that she would not trade it for any more articulate declaration she could imagine. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They went back inside to start the day's work. Ada came by that afternoon, as she often did when the weather broke, with a covered dish and the season's first news from the valley. She looked at Elena when she came through the door, and then looked at Cole, who was at the table with the records, and she looked at Elena again with the particular perceptiveness of a woman who had been watching people for 45 years. She said nothing about it. She set the dish down and poured herself coffee and started telling them about the Greer family's new water situation and the condition of the South Road, which had washed partially out in the thaw. But when she was leaving, she stopped in the doorway and looked at Elena and said, You look different. Spring, Elena said. Sure, Ada said, and left. Spring brought its own work, which was different from winter work in almost every quality except the volume of it. The fence repair that had been waiting since the blizzard, the planting that needed to start as soon as the ground was workable, the cattle that needed to be moved to the upper pastures now that the snow had pulled back from the higher ground. Elena expanded her kitchen garden again, this time with a plan she had been developing through February, drawn out in rough pencil on the back of a feed receipt because that was what was available. And she and Cole spent 3 days in early April working the new section of ground together, turning soil in companionable near silence. On the second day, Will Hargrove came by to help with the upper fence line, and he and Cole worked through the afternoon while Elena finished the garden beds, and at the end of the day, Will looked at the expanded garden and said, That's going to be a serious operation. That's the idea, Elena said. You're going to have more produce than you can use. I know. I'm going to sell the surplus in Millhaven. She had been thinking about this since February. Thomas Greer had mentioned once that the general store regularly ran short on preserved goods through the winter. She had been doing math since then. Will looked at Cole. Cole looked at Elena. You didn't mention that part, he said. I'm mentioning it now, she said. Is there a problem with it? No, he said. I'm just trying to figure out when you thought of it. February, she said. I had a lot of time to think in February. Will laughed out loud at that. A genuine laugh, not the polite kind. Cole shook his head slightly, and she saw the real smile, the one that came out fully now sometimes when she caught him off guard, the one that changed his entire face. You're going to be selling produce to Greer by October, Will said. By September, Elena said. She was right. She sold the first load of preserved vegetables to Greer's store in the last week of August. 5 dozen jars of various goods, for a price she had negotiated with Thomas Greer in a conversation she had been quietly preparing for since June. Greer paid her fairly and said he wanted the same arrangement through the winter, and she walked out of the general store with money that was hers, not Cole's, not the ranch's, hers, for the first time in her life. She bought Cole a new pair of work gloves because his had worn through. and she bought herself a book from the dry goods display because she had been looking at it every time they came to town since April, and she came back out to the wagon where Cole was loading supplies and handed him the gloves. He looked at them. "What's this?" "Yours wore through months ago, and you've been making do," she said. He turned them over in his hands. "Elena." "I have money," she said. "I'm going to spend some of it on things we need. That's how this works." He looked at her with that expression she had learned so well by now, the recalibrating one, the one that appeared when she did something that updated his understanding of what she was. Then he put the gloves in his coat pocket and said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said, and climbed up onto the wagon. They drove home through the September afternoon, with the mountains doing what the mountains did in that season, going amber and gold and a particular shade of red-brown that she had no name for, but that she looked for every year now as a marker, a sign that another cycle of this life was turning over into the next one. It was on that drive, with the mountains going golden and Cole beside her and the wagon loaded and the book in her lap, and the good dry smell of the early autumn in the air, that Elena felt something she recognized from the moment on the train when Ohio had rolled away behind her and the sky had opened up. The feeling of a breath finally released. She had been right to write the letter. She had been right to get on the train. She had been right about almost none of the details. She had been wrong about how hard it would be, wrong about how much she would have to learn, wrong about how much it would hurt to build something out of nothing with a man who couldn't say what he felt without it costing him something. But she had been right about the essential thing, which was that somewhere better than Ohio existed and that she was capable of surviving the distance between here and there. She was more than surviving. She looked at Cole. He was watching the road with both hands on the reins, the new gloves on the seat beside him because he hadn't put them on yet, just kept touching them once in a while. Absent-mindedly, the way you touched something that meant something without wanting to make a production of it. She looked at the road ahead and at the mountains and at her own hands in her lap, the scar on her left palm from the winter fence wire, the calluses that had replaced the dish soap softness of her Ohio hands. She was going to tell him about the other things she had noticed, the things she had been sitting with for 3 weeks, trying to be certain before she said it. She had been certain for about a week now, but she had been working out how to approach it because she had learned enough about Cole Bennett over these 8 months to know that this particular piece of news was going to land differently for him than it would for most men, for reasons he had told her once in a quiet evening by the stove, and that she had filed in the most careful place she kept things. His mother had died in childbirth. He had been born into the world and his mother had left it on the same day, and his father had carried that fact for the rest of his life like a wound that never closed. And Cole had grown up inside that grief, even though it predated his memory, had grown up knowing that his arrival in the world had come at a cost that his father never fully recovered from charging. She had been thinking about that for 3 weeks. She had been thinking about what it meant for a man like Cole, private, careful, already more accustomed to loss than was fair, to receive the news she had to give him. She had been thinking about how to tell him the truth and also give him room for whatever the truth was going to do to him. She didn't say it on the wagon. She waited until they were home and the supplies were put away and the horses were settled and the evening meal was done and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee between them and the day finally going quiet around them. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him. "I have to tell you something," she said. He looked up. She told him. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence she had come to know over their 8 months of marriage, the silence of two people who didn't need noise between them. This was a different quality of silence entirely. The silence of a man who had received a piece of information that was traveling through him, looking for where to land, passing through joy and fear, and something that might have been old grief, and something else she didn't have a name for. His face was doing things she hadn't seen it do before. She waited. "When?" he said finally. "February or March, I think," she said. "Late winter." He was quiet again. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. His eyes had the particular look of a man standing at a great height, looking down, trying to figure out what he was standing on. "I know what you're thinking about," she said. He didn't deny it. "We are not your parents," she said. "I am not your mother, and this is not the same story." "You don't know that," he said. His voice was careful in a way that was different from his usual careful, tighter, like he was managing something that wanted to move fast. "I know that nothing has happened yet that says it will be," she said. "And I know that I am not going to let fear decide this for us before anything has actually gone wrong." "Elena, I mean it," she said. "I came here from Ohio with a carpet bag and $40 and no map, Cole. I went out into a January blizzard with a rope over my shoulder because you were out in it. I am not a woman who lets fear make the decisions. That's not who I am." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the September evening was doing its quiet Colorado thing, the light going long and gold across the mountains, the cattle moving slowly in the pasture, the particular end-of-day sounds of a working ranch settling into its night rhythms. "No," he said, finally. "You're not." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed like that for a while, at the kitchen table in the September evening, with the thing between them that was going to change everything, and around them the ranch they had built together out of two people's separate, desperate courage. And Elena thought, "We have survived a winter. We have survived a blizzard. We have built something real out of nothing. Whatever came next, they would not face it as strangers. They would not face it as a practical arrangement. They would face it as what they had become, one day at a time, one repaired fence and one stitched wound and one honest conversation at a time. Two imperfect people who had found each other through a letter and a train and a country's worth of distance, and had built something in this high Colorado valley that was solid enough to hold whatever the next season brought." She kept his hand in hers. Outside, the last of the September light went gold across the mountains, and then slowly, gently, let the dark come in. Cole didn't sleep that night. Elena knew because she didn't sleep either, not fully, and in the hours between midnight and the first gray of morning, she was aware of him lying beside her with the particular stillness of a man who was working very hard at something inside himself, the kind of stillness that was actually the opposite of rest. She didn't reach for him. She didn't say anything. She had learned enough about Cole Bennett to know that some things needed to move through him at their own pace, that pushing only made him go quiet in a way that took longer to come back from. She lay in the dark and listened to him not sleep, and she thought her own thoughts, which were not uncomplicated. She was frightened too. She had not said that at the kitchen table because it hadn't been the right thing to say. What he needed at the table was someone standing on solid ground, and she had stood there, and she had meant every word. But lying in the dark was different from sitting at the kitchen table, and in the dark she let herself know the full shape of what she was carrying. She was 19 years old. There was no doctor within 40 miles that she knew of. She had watched Ada Hargrove set a broken arm, and she had stitched Cole's head wound in a blizzard, and she understood by now that this land required you to handle things yourself, and she was not naive about what that meant for what was coming. She was not her mother. She held on to that. Her mother had been sick before she had Elena, sick in ways that nobody had fully understood at the time, and she had died of things that had nothing to do with childbirth and everything to do with a body that had been losing a long fight for years. Elena was healthy. She was strong in ways she hadn't been a year ago, built by 8 months of ranch work into someone whose body knew what it could do. She was not Cole's mother either. She had said that at the table, and she had meant it, and she still meant it. But in the dark, she understood more completely why Cole was lying awake beside her. Because what she was the person he loved, and love made the facts of mortality personal in a way that statistics couldn't touch. Around 4 in the morning, Cole spoke. "I don't know how to do this," he said. Not to her specifically, more to the dark, to the ceiling, to whatever was listening. "Nobody does the first time," she said. A pause. "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. He was quiet. "Tell me," she said. Another long pause. Outside, the mountains were doing their nighttime thing, enormous and silent and indifferent, which she had stopped finding cold and had come to find honest. The cattle had settled hours ago. The ranch was completely still. "My father used to go to her grave on my birthday," Cole said. "Every year. He'd be gone most of the morning. He never said where he was going, but I followed him once when I was about 12 and I found out." He stopped. "He never told me to feel responsible. He wasn't a man who talked about things like that. But you can understand something without being told. Elena lay very still. I understood that my arriving in the world had cost him the person he... Cole stopped again, started differently. I don't want that for our child, he said. I don't want them to carry that. Then we make sure they don't have to, Elena said. And if something goes wrong, Cole. Her voice was not sharp, but it was definite. We are not going to build a life around a fear of something that has not happened. I refuse to do that. I watched my aunt do that her whole life. She was so afraid of ending up with nothing that she made everyone around her miserable trying to hold on to everything, and she ended up with nothing anyway because people left. Fear doesn't protect you, it just narrows you until there's not enough of you left to hold on to what matters. Silence. That's the most you've ever said all at once, he said. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, she said. He made the sound that was his closest equivalent to a laugh when something was too serious for an actual laugh. She felt some of the tension go out of the air between them. I hear you, he said, after a moment. But, she said, because there was a but. She could feel it. But I'm still afraid, he said. I'm telling you, because you deserve to know that. I hear what you're saying, and I agree with it, and I'm still afraid. She reached over in the dark and found his hand. I know, she said. So am I. He turned his head toward her. She could feel it rather than see it. You didn't say that at the table, he said. You needed me to be the steady one at the table, she said. Here in the dark, we can both be honest. He held her hand in both of his, the way he had that night after the blizzard. We're going to be all right, she said. Not as a promise, because she was not in the business of making promises about things outside her control, as a statement of intent, as the direction she was choosing. He didn't say it back, but his hands tightened around hers, and she understood that as the same thing said differently, which was how Cole Bennett said most things. They slept, eventually. Not much, but some. Ada came 2 days later. Elena had not sent for her. She had not yet figured out exactly what her timeline was for telling people, which was its own complicated calculation. But Ada arrived on a Wednesday morning with bread and the news about the Hargroves' spring cattle count and took one look at Elena standing at the stove and said, How far along? Elena turned around. How did you know? You're holding the coffee cup without drinking it, Ada said. You love coffee. Something's changed about coffee. She set the bread on the table and pulled out a chair and sat down in the decisive way she did everything. How far along? I think about 5 months, Elena said. February or March. Ada looked at her steadily. And Cole? He knows. She paused, choosing her words the way she'd learned to choose them around Ada, who had no patience for imprecision. He's managing his history. Ada absorbed this. His mother, she said. Yes. Ada was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. When she looked up, her expression had shifted into something that was not quite softness. Ada didn't do softness, exactly, but was the closest thing to it that Ada's face produced. Bernard lost his first wife, she said. Before me. Fever. He didn't tell me for almost 2 years, and then he told me all at once on a Tuesday in November and cried for the first time since it happened. She paused. Men like that carry things whole. It doesn't break down the way it does for some people. It just sits there, whole, waiting. I know, Elena said. You're going to need to give him something to do, Ada said. Cole without a task is Cole inside his own head, and Cole's own head is not a good place for him to live right now. Elena looked at her. What kind of task? Practical ones, Ada said. What does the baby need that the ranch doesn't have yet? Give him a list and let him build towards something instead of brood towards something. Elena thought about this for the rest of the day, and that evening at supper she said, I think we need to add a room to the cabin. Cole looked up from his plate. The second room is fine for storage, she said, but it's not set up for anything else, and come February it's going to need to be. I'd like to think about what that involves. He put his fork down slowly. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and she watched him understand what she was doing. Not just the practical thing, but the reason behind it. And she watched him decide, consciously and visibly, to let it work. The south wall would be the place to expand, he said after a moment. The foundation extends that direction already. How much work? 3 weeks? Maybe 4, if we start soon. He was already somewhere else in his head. She could see it, the shift from the place where the fear lived to the place where the practical lived, which in Cole was well lit and well organized and where he functioned best. I'll need lumber. I can get it from the mill in Dunmore cheaper than Millhaven. Bernard might help, she said. Bernard would help, he said without question. Will too, probably. Then we should start planning, she said. He picked his fork back up and finished his supper, and she watched the set of his shoulders change over the course of the meal. Not completely, not a transformation, but a degree, the way a man's body changes when his mind has found somewhere useful to go. Ada had been right. She usually was. The room addition began the following Saturday, when Bernard and both his sons arrived at 7 in the morning with tools and a workable plan that Cole had roughed out during the week. Elena made breakfast for 5 and watched from the kitchen window as Cole and Bernard stood over the plan drawing, adjusting things, pointing at the south wall in the particular way of men discussing structural problems. And she thought, this is what it looks like when a community takes care of its own. She had not had that in Ohio. Margaret's house had been an island, entirely self-referential, closed against the outside world in the way that small, frightened lives closed against anything that might complicate them. Here, the opposite was true. The harder things got, the more the network pulled tight, the more people showed up on Saturday morning with tools because someone needed a room added to a cabin. The work went faster than Cole had estimated, because 4 men working in the same direction and Bernard Hargrove knowing several construction shortcuts that Cole had not thought of made the difference between 3 weeks and 2.5. Elena contributed where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't, which was a calculation she had gotten reasonably good at over the past year. She brought food and water out at intervals. She made decisions about the interior when asked, the placement of the window, the direction the door swung, the height of the shelf that would go on the east wall. On the day they finished the rough framing, Cole stood inside the new room in the late afternoon light and was quiet for a long time. Elena came and stood beside him. The room was empty, framed but not yet finished, smelling of new wood and sawdust. The Colorado autumn coming through the new window in long rectangles of pale gold light. It was small, it was plain, it was completely sufficient for what it was for. "It's good work," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Are you all right?" He turned and looked at her, and his face had the open quality that still cost him something. Less than it used to, she thought, but still something. And he said, "I'm trying to be." "That's enough," she said. He put his arm around her carefully, in the way he had of doing things that involved her physical person now that the pregnancy was visible. Not overcautious exactly, but attending, the way you attended to something that mattered. She leaned into him slightly, her shoulder against his chest, and they stood in the new room in the autumn light for a minute that was not long enough for either of them to want to break it. "My father never built anything for her," Cole said. "She was already gone when he got here. He built the cabin for himself. That's how he always thought of it." Elena waited. "I don't want to think of things that way," he said. "You don't," she said. "You built this." He looked around the room, nodded once, slowly, the way he confirmed things to himself when the confirmation was important, and he wanted it to stick. Then he dropped his arm from her shoulders and said, "I'll start on the interior tomorrow," and went back to the main room to clean up the day's tools. And Elena stood in the new room alone for another moment, looking at the autumn light on the new wood floor. She placed her hand flat on the wall he had built. She thought, it's going to be all right. She believed it more than she had in the dark 3 weeks ago. Not because anything had been guaranteed. Nothing on this land was ever guaranteed, and she knew that better than she had known anything before she came here, but because the two of them had done what they always did. They had taken the fear and given it a task, and the task was this room, and the room was real. And real things were what she had always trusted more than possibilities. October deepened around them. The valley went gold and red-brown in its autumn way, the way she had been watching it for a year now, and still found it stopped her sometimes when she wasn't expecting it. The cattle were moved to the winter pastures. The garden's final harvest was brought in and processed. Elena worked more slowly now, She had to, her body requiring accommodations she made without particular grace, because grace had never been high on her list of priorities. She dropped a jar of preserved tomatoes one afternoon and stood looking at it on the floor with a feeling that was out of proportion to a dropped jar. And Ada, who happened to be there, said, "Leave it," and poured her a glass of water and made her sit down. And Elena sat and drank the water and said, "I hate this part." And Ada said, "The last 2 months are the worst. Then it gets better in a different way," which was, for Ada, practically poetry. Cole watched her with a vigilance she had to consciously decide not to find irritating. Not because she didn't understand it. She understood it completely. She knew exactly what drove it and where it came from. But because there was a version of it that could easily become its own kind of trap. A vigilance so focused on protecting her from harm that it stopped seeing her as someone capable of managing herself. She had not come here to be managed. She had not survived Ohio in a blizzard and a frontier winter to become someone who needed to be watched constantly in case she broke. She said this to him directly one evening in late October because she had found that the only thing that worked with Cole was saying things directly. "I need you to trust me to know my own limits," she said. "I will tell you when something is wrong. I will not try to work through something that needs attention. But I need you to let me move around my own house without treating me like I'm made of glass." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you're not made of glass," he said. "I know you know that," she said. "Your face doesn't always know it." He absorbed this. "I'll try," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said. He tried. He didn't entirely succeed, which she had expected, but the trying meant that it happened less often, which was what she had actually needed, which she had also expected. She had learned, over a year of being married to this man, to ask for what was actually needed rather than the ideal version of it, because the ideal version of most things lived in a country she'd never been to and didn't expect to visit. What she had was real. She was consistently grateful for real. November arrived with the first cold, but nothing like the previous year's early assault, and Elena moved through the shortened days with the strange combination of physical heaviness and mental alertness that the last months had produced. Her body slower, her mind faster, making lists and plans and contingencies with a focus she recognized as the same instinct that had made her insulate the waterline before the first frost. The instinct that said, "Prepare, because when the moment comes, there won't be time." She and Ada had talked through what to expect. Ada had attended 7 births in this valley, not as a midwife by training, but as the most capable and steady woman available, which in a community without a doctor amounted to the same thing. She knew what she was doing. She told Elena plainly what labor looked like, what was normal and what wasn't, what the signs of trouble were and what to do about each one. And Elena listened with the same attention she had brought to every practical education this land had given her. "Are you afraid?" Ada asked once after one of these sessions. "Yes," Elena said. "Are you?" Ada looked at her. "Every time," she said. "Doesn't stop me from knowing what to do." "No," Elena said, "it doesn't." It was Bernard Hargrove who finally reached Cole in the way that sometimes only another man could reach a man who was carrying something heavy and male and not easily translated into words. It happened on a Saturday in mid-November, while they were finishing the interior of the new room, the last of the shelving, the small repairs to the window fitting that had let in a draft. Elena was in the main cabin and could hear them talking through the thin wall, not the words exactly, but the rhythm of the conversation, which started in the ordinary practical register, and then shifted into something slower and more deliberate that made her go still over her sewing and listen. She couldn't make out what Bernard said. She heard Cole's voice respond, and Bernard's again, and then a long silence, and then Cole said something that she heard clearly through the wall, even though he wasn't speaking loud. "I just can't stop thinking about what happens if she doesn't," and Bernard said something quiet and steady, and there was another silence, and when they came back into the main cabin an hour later to wash up for the midday meal, Cole's face was different, not repaired, not resolved, but changed in the way a wound changed after it had been properly cleaned, still there, still tender, but no longer working against itself. She did not ask him what Bernard had said. She made the meal and they ate it together, and afterwards Cole helped her clear the table, which he had been doing more often lately without being asked, and when she went to lift the heavy pot, He got to it first, and she let him, and neither of them made anything of it. Later, when Bernard was gone and the afternoon had gone gray and quiet, Cole sat at the kitchen table with the records, and Elena sat across from him with her sewing, and after a while he said, without looking up, "Bernard lost his first wife." "I know," Elena said. "Ada told me." He looked up at that. "She told me he didn't talk about it for 2 years," Elena said, "and then he told her everything on a Tuesday in November." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "Today is a Tuesday in November," he said. "I know," she said. He looked back down at his records. She went back to her sewing. After a few minutes, he said, "He told me I was doing what his father did after his first wife died, not grieving something that happened, grieving something that might happen. He said it was the same thing, but it wasn't. The one that happened is a fact. The one that might happen is a story you're telling yourself." Elena kept her eyes on her sewing. "He said you can't protect someone by being afraid for them," Cole continued. "You protect someone by showing up." "Bernard is a wise man," Elena said. "He said that too," Cole said, with a dryness that made her look up. And when she looked up, he was almost smiling. She went back to her sewing so he wouldn't see that she was doing the same. December came in, and with it the anniversary of the blizzard, though neither of them named it as that. Just noticed it the way you noticed the anniversary of things that had mattered, with a private interior recognition that wasn't necessarily spoken. Elena looked at the door one morning in the first week of December and thought about the rope and the white wall of snow and Cole's face when she found him and his hand in hers through the night. She thought that was the beginning of what we are. She thought that most often at unexpected moments, not the dramatic ones, but the small ones. Cole repairing the stove latch without being asked. Cole getting up in the night when she couldn't sleep and sitting in the kitchen with her, not talking, just being there, which was its own language. Cole finishing the new room 2 days before she'd expected him to, and then standing in the doorway looking at it with a face that was private and careful, and hers in the way that his private, careful things had become hers over the course of this year. She was 8.5 months along when the letter came from Ohio. She recognized Margaret's handwriting on the envelope before she could register surprise. She stood at the kitchen table with the letter in her hand for a moment before she opened it, feeling the old, reflexive tightening that Margaret's handwriting still produced, the body's memory being slower to update than the mind. The letter was short. "Elena, I have heard you are in Colorado, married. I am writing to say that I am aware I was not always—" Here there were words scratched out, replaced, scratched out again. "I am not a woman who finds these letters easy to write. I hope you are well. If the child you are expecting is a girl, you might consider naming her something your mother would have liked. Your mother's name was Frances. You probably didn't know that. You were too young. M.W." Elena read it twice. She sat down at the kitchen table and read it a third time. Cole came in from outside and saw her face and said, "What is it?" And she handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it, and his mouth tightened, and he set it down and looked at her. "That's all she's got after 2 years?" he said. "For Margaret, this is—" Elena stopped, started again. "She scratched out the apology," she said, "but she tried to write it. That's as close as she comes. Does it help?" Elena looked at the letter on the table, thought about the kitchen in Ohio, the list of 12 tasks, the birthday that had passed without acknowledgement, thought about the newspaper left by a traveling salesman and the 3 sentences that had changed everything. "A little," she said. "Not as much as it would have once." "What does that mean?" "It means I don't need it the way I would have needed it a year ago," she said. "I have things now that I didn't have then. You can't heal old wounds and new things at the same time. The new things take the space." Cole looked at her steadily. He looked at the letter. He looked back at her. "Frances," he said. She looked up. "If it's a girl," he said. "Frances." Something moved through her chest that she didn't have an immediate name for. Something warm and specific, the feeling of 2 things connecting across a distance that had seemed too large to bridge. "Yes," she said, "Frances." He nodded once and picked up the letter and folded it back into its envelope and placed it on the shelf where they kept the important papers. And then he went to the stove and checked the firewood supply and said, "I'm going to bring in more wood before it gets dark," and went back outside. and Elena sat at the table looking at where the letter had been and felt the particular quality of being completely in the right place. Not comfort, exactly, not the absence of difficulty, but the solid sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which she had decided was the closest thing to peace that was available on honest terms. She put her hands flat on the table and felt the wood under her palms. The same table they had sat at on her first night here. The same table where she had stitched his wound, where they had gone over the records together, where she had told him she loved him and he had said yes for a while, and where she had told him about the baby and held his hand through the night that followed. Every important thing had happened at this table. She thought, Francis. She thought, my mother's name. Outside, she could hear Cole moving around the woodpile, the particular sound of wood being stacked that she had heard through every season of this life, steady and deliberate and there, always there. The mountains were doing what they did in December, standing enormous and white and absolute on the horizon, neither threatening nor comforting, just true, just present, just the shape of the world she lived in now, the world she had chosen with a letter and a train and a carpet bag and $40, and the only courage she'd had, which had turned out to be exactly enough. She was not afraid of what was coming. She was afraid and she was ready, which was not the same as not afraid, but was, she had decided, better. She was more than an Ohio girl who had answered an advertisement. She was Elena Bennett, and she had a ranch and a husband and a room with new wood walls and a letter that said her mother's name was Frances. And in a few weeks she was going to find out what she was made of in the most definitive way the world had yet offered her. She already knew the answer. She had known it since January, on a rope in a blizzard, moving forward one step at a time towards something she could not see but refused to stop believing was there. Cole came back in with the wood, and she got up to start supper, and the December evening closed around the cabin like a hand closing gently around something it intended to keep. Frances Bennett arrived on a Thursday in January, exactly 1 year after the blizzard. Elena did not think about the symmetry of that until much later, until she had slept and eaten and was capable of thinking about anything beyond what the previous 18 hours had required of her. But afterward, when she did think about it, it seemed exactly right, that the thing which had nearly taken Cole from her and the thing that completed their family would share the same month, the same brutal season, as if the land itself was making a point about the nature of this place. It could take and it could give, and both happened on its own terms and not yours. Ada had arrived the evening before, when the contractions were still manageable and widely spaced, and she had moved through the cabin with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this enough times to know exactly when to be concerned and when not to be. She had sent Cole to the Hargroves, not because he would have been useless, but because Ada understood something about men like Cole that Elena was still learning, that there were moments when their presence became another thing to manage, another fear to hold alongside your own, and a woman in labor did not need to be managing anyone else's fear. Cole had not wanted to go. I'll stay outside, he said, on the porch. I won't come in unless you need me. You'll freeze on the porch, Elena said. I don't care. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression she knew completely by now, the one that said he had arrived at a position and was prepared to hold it indefinitely. She thought about arguing and decided against it. Fine, she said. Stay on the porch, but go to the barn if it gets too cold. I mean it. He stayed on the porch. Ada checked on him twice through the night, and both times he was sitting on the bench with his coat on and his hat down, and his hands between his knees, not moving, in the particular stillness of a man doing the only thing available to him, which was waiting. Ada reported this to Elena with the neutral tone of someone delivering weather information, and Elena, who was at that point well past the manageable stage, said, "Stubborn," and Ada said, "Yes," and they returned to the work. The hardest part lasted 4 hours. Elena would not have said afterward that she handled it with any particular dignity, because dignity was not the point, and she had stopped caring about it somewhere around hour 2. What she had was Ada's voice, low and steady and directing, and her own body's animal knowledge of what it was trying to do, and the stubborn refusal to stop, the same refusal that had gotten her across half a country with a carpet bag and tied a rope to a porch post in a blizzard and stitched a head wound at a kitchen table. It was the same refusal. It had always been the same refusal, just wearing different circumstances. Frances came into the world at 6:15 in the morning, with the January light just beginning to reach through the frost-edged window. She was red-faced and loud about her opinions from the first breath, and Ada held her and made the assessment that mattered: breathing, color, sound, and said, "She's good," in a voice that Elena recognized as Ada, reserving the larger emotion for later, which was Ada's way. And Elena lay back and felt the specific quality of an 18-hour effort arriving at its point. Ada brought the baby to her. Elena looked at her daughter's face, wrinkled and furious and entirely new, and felt something she had no prepared language for. Not the neat cinematic emotion she might have imagined, but something rawer and more structural than that, like a wall going up inside her that had not existed before, that would now exist for the rest of her life. "Go get Cole," she said to Ada. Ada went to the door and opened it and said, "Come in." And Elena heard his boots on the porch floor and then the door, and then his steps crossing the cabin, and then he was in the doorway of the new room, the room he had built with Bernard and his sons in the October light. And he stood there looking at her and at the bundle in her arms, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before and did not have a word for. She held Frances out toward him. He crossed the room and took his daughter with the carefulness of someone handling the most important thing he had ever held, which was accurate. And he stood there with her and looked at her face, and whatever he was feeling moved through him visibly, without the careful management he usually applied to what showed on his face. He looked up at Elena. "Frances?" he said. "Frances," she said. His jaw tightened once, the way it did when he was holding something in, and then he sat down in the chair beside the bed and held his daughter. And Elena watched him and thought about the man who had placed an advertisement in a newspaper because he was lonely and honest enough to say so, and the grave he had told her about that his father visited on his birthday, and the blizzard, and the rope, and the kitchen table, and the letter from Ohio with her mother's name in it. She thought, this is what all of that was for, not just for this moment, not for the baby specifically, but for what they had built that made this moment possible. The 2 years of daily effort and imperfect love and honest conversation and showing up, which was less romantic than it sounded and more essential than anything else she knew. Ada left in the late morning with the particular grace of someone who understood when their presence was no longer the main thing needed. She patted Elena's hand once, firmly, said, "You did fine," which Elena understood was the highest available rating in Ada's system, and went home to her own ranch and her own life. The three of them were alone. The first days were harder than Elena had expected, and she had expected them to be hard. Frances was not a peaceful baby. She had opinions about everything, and communicated them constantly and at volume. And Elena, whose body was trying to recover from 18 hours of labor while simultaneously learning an entirely new skill set, operated on a quantity of sleep that did not qualify as sleep by any reasonable standard. Cole was there. He was not graceful about it. He was not naturally suited to the specific helplessness of a new baby, who required things he could not fix with a tool or solve with a plan. He burned the breakfast twice in the first week. He held Frances in a way that was too careful and too rigid at first, afraid of his own strength, until Elena said, "She's not going to break. You can relax your arms." And he made the adjustment with visible effort. But he was there. Every time Elena woke in the night, he was awake. He brought her water without being asked, in the instinctive, constant way of someone who had quietly organized their life around paying attention to what another person needed. He sat with Frances when she was unsettled, rocking her with the patience of a man who had spent years alone and knew how to wait. And Elena would lie back for 20 minutes and close her eyes and hear his voice through the wall, low and almost tuneless, talking to his daughter about nothing in particular, about the ranch, about the fence line, about what spring would look like, and the sound of it did something to her that she was too tired to examine directly, but felt completely. The fear did not leave him all at once. She had not expected it to. What she saw over the first weeks was him making the same decision she had made, the one she had made on the porch in December when she decided she was ready, the one he had been working toward since Bernard had talked to him on a Tuesday in November. He made it incrementally, daily, the way you built anything real. One small decision at a time, each one marginally less governed by what he was afraid of and marginally more governed by what was actually in front of him. What was actually in front of him was Francis. Francis, who had his coloring and Elena's stubbornness and opinions about things that seemed to increase by the week. Francis, who settled most reliably in the crook of his arm in the specific way of babies who understood instinctively where the safest harbor was. Francis, who one morning at 6 weeks old looked directly at her father's face with the focused intensity of a person making an assessment, and Cole said, "She's looking at me," as if this were news. And Elena said, "She's been looking at you for 2 weeks. And he said, "Not like that." And Elena looked at his face and thought, the fear just lost significant ground. She was right. It didn't vanish. That was not how fear worked in people like Cole, and she had stopped expecting the clean resolution that existed in stories. What happened was more ordinary than that, and more durable. It got smaller. Incrementally, across weeks and then months, it got smaller, crowded out by the dailiness of his daughter's existence, which was large and specific and present and demanded his attention in ways that left less room for the stories he'd been telling himself. Spring came, and with it the first anniversary of Francis's birth approaching, and the second anniversary of Elena's arrival in Mill Haven on the westbound train. She stood at the kitchen garden in April, Francis on her hip, looking at the ground she had amended and replanted twice now. And she thought about the girl who had stood at a sink in Ohio and read 3 sentences in a borrowed newspaper. She thought about what that girl had known and what she had not known. She had known she needed to leave. She had known she was capable of more than what Margaret's kitchen had asked of her. She had known, with some deep and stubborn private certainty, that the version of herself she was in Ohio was not the whole version. What she had not known was what the whole version looked like. She knew now. She thought about what it had taken, not the dramatic things, not the blizzard, though the blizzard was part of it, the less dramatic things. The 11 days of waiting for Cole's first letter. The decision to tell the truth in that letter instead of presenting a better version of herself. The fence posts she had learned to reset, and the stall she had mucked wrong, and the biscuits she had burned, and the cornbread that Will had complimented, and the root vegetables in the amended soil. The rope on the porch post. The stitches. The record she had reorganized. The kitchen table at which everything that mattered had happened. The ordinary bravery, which she had come to understand was the only kind that actually sustained anything. It was easy to be brave once. It was hard to be brave in the regular, unremarkable way, to show up every day and do the thing that needed doing and tell the truth, even when it was complicated, and stay when staying was difficult, and love someone honestly enough that you let them see you frightened in the dark. That was the thing nobody put in the advertisement. She thought about what she would say to the girl in the Ohio kitchen, if she could say anything. Not the comforting version, not the version that made it sound easier than it was. The true version. It will be harder than you think and better than you can imagine, and the better will not cancel out the harder. It will just make the harder worth what it cost. That was what she had. Cole came out of the barn and saw her standing in the garden with Francis on her hip and the April light on her face, and he stopped for a moment, the way he sometimes stopped when he came upon her unexpectedly. A brief pause that she had come to understand as the pause of a man who was still, 2 years in, doing the quiet arithmetic of how his life had changed. "What are you thinking about?" he called across the yard. "Ohio," she said. He walked toward her, took Francis from her arm with the ease he had developed over these months, the ease that had replaced the early careful rigidity, and settled his daughter against his chest in the particular way that was theirs. Francis grabbed his collar with both hands, which was also theirs. "What about it?" he said. She looked at him, at the ranch behind him, the barn and the outbuildings and the fence lines running toward the mountains, at the mountains themselves, still wearing their winter white at the peaks, but beginning to lose it lower down. "I was thinking that I don't miss it," she said, "not even a little." He looked at her for a moment with the direct, uncomplicated look that she had spent a year earning, and now received like water received light, as the most natural thing in the world. "Good," he said. That was all. It was enough. Francis grabbed his collar tighter and made her opinion of the morning known at volume, and Cole shifted her to his other arm with the patience she had watched him build from nothing, and Elena turned back to her garden, and the April light moved across the Colorado Valley in the way it moved, without asking permission, without making promises, just arriving and being what it was. This was what they had made. Not a perfect life. There was no such thing on this land, and she had stopped wanting one, because perfect lives were sealed against the world, and sealed lives didn't grow. What they had was open to the weather and the seasons and the difficulty of real things, and that openness was exactly what made it worth having. Two broken people had written letters to each other across 500 miles of uncertainty, and they had built this, not because they were exceptional, not because fate had arranged it neatly, but because they had both chosen, on ordinary days and difficult ones, to be honest and to stay and to do the next thing that needed doing. That was the whole of it. That was everything.